Hey there! Grab yourself a coffee and enjoy the story. The elevator doors closed with a soft ping, sealing Grace Morgan inside the steel capsule for the last time. She took a deep breath, savoring the familiar scent of lemon polish and expensive cologne that permeated the executive floor of the Morgan Tower. Everything around her gleamed. The polished brass fixtures, the marble floors, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city she had called home for all of her 30 years. But today, Grace wasn't admiring the view. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the button for the underground parking garage, where her assistant, Charlotte, waited with a modest sedan that looked nothing like the luxury vehicles Grace typically drove. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Miss Morgan?" Samuel Reynolds asked, his voice heavy with concern. The elderly lawyer had served the Morgan family for over 3 decades, and the worry lines etched around his eyes had deepened considerably since Grace had announced her plans 2 weeks ago. "I've never been more certain of anything, Samuel," Grace replied, her amber eyes reflecting the determination that had made her father, James Morgan, one of the most successful businessmen in America. "For once in my life, I want someone to see me, just me, not the Morgan fortune or the company or the social standing." Samuel nodded reluctantly. As the trustee of the Morgan estate and Grace's legal advisor since her father's passing 3 years earlier, he understood her reasoning better than most. He had witnessed firsthand how Grace's dating life had become a parade of opportunists and social climbers, each one more interested in her bank account than her heart. "The arrangements have been made as you requested," Samuel said, consulting his tablet. "The property is leased for 1 year under the name Grace Williams. It's a modest 3-bedroom house in Millfield, approximately 2 hours from here. Charlotte has established your cover identity as a freelance graphic designer with a reasonable but not extravagant income. Your primary accounts will remain frozen except for the special account we've created with enough funds to maintain your new lifestyle convincingly." Grace nodded, the weight of the diamond earrings she wore suddenly feeling heavy and conspicuous. She reached up and removed them, dropping the small fortune into Samuel's outstretched palm. "And the company? The board has been informed that you're taking a sabbatical for personal reasons. They've agreed to maintain the current executive structure with quarterly remote check-ins, which I'll facilitate. As the majority shareholder, you can, of course, return at any time, but they'll manage without direct leadership for the agreed 12 months. The elevator doors opened to reveal the dimly lit parking garage. Grace stepped out, the click of her designer heels echoing against the concrete walls. For a moment, she hesitated. Was she being ridiculous? Giving up the comforts of her penthouse, her status, her identity, all to find something as intangible as genuine connection? Samuel seemed to read her thoughts. "Your father would have understood, Grace. Despite his success, James never forgot what it meant to be seen for who you are, not what you own." A lump formed in Grace's throat at the mention of her father. Since his unexpected death from a heart attack 3 years ago, she had thrown herself into running Morgan Enterprises, expanding the technology and real estate empire he had built from nothing. She had proven herself more than capable, doubling the company's value and earning the grudging respect of board members who had initially questioned whether a young woman could fill James Morgan's formidable shoes. But professional success hadn't filled the void left by her father's passing, nor had it brought her any closer to finding the kind of loving partnership her parents had shared before her mother's death, when Grace was just 12 years old. "I need to do this, Samuel," she said finally, "just for a little while." The lawyer nodded and handed her a plain leather handbag, so unlike the exclusive designer pieces she usually carried. "This contains your new driver's license, credit cards, and other identification documents for Grace Williams. Charlotte has already transported your new wardrobe to the house. Remember, nothing too extravagant. We've carefully curated items that would be reasonable for someone of your cover identity's means." Grace accepted the bag, slinging it over her shoulder with a determined smile. "How do I look? Like a normal person?" Samuel chuckled despite his concern. "You look lovely as always, but less ostentatious. The haircut helps." Grace ran her fingers through her newly shortened locks, still not entirely used to the shoulder-length style that had replaced her signature long waves. The color was different too, a warmer, more subdued brown instead of the caramel highlights her expensive stylist had maintained. Small changes, but effective ones. Charlotte looked up from her phone as Grace approached the modest blue sedan. The assistant's expression revealed her continued discomfort with the plan, but she had agreed to help maintain Grace's cover, acting as the primary liaison between Grace and Samuel. "Everything's ready at the house," Charlotte reported, as Grace slid into the passenger seat. "Utilities connected, pantry stocked, internet working. I've set up your home office with mid-range equipment. Good enough for a successful freelancer, but nothing that would raise eyebrows." "Thank you, Charlotte," Grace said, buckling her seatbelt. "I know you think I've lost my mind." Charlotte pulled the car out of the parking space, navigating toward the exit. "It's not my place to judge, Miss Morgan, but I do worry. The world can be unkind when it doesn't know who you are." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Grace replied softly. "I want to experience life without the buffer of wealth and privilege, just for a while. I want to know if I'm still myself without all of this." She gestured toward the towering Morgan building as they emerged onto the street. As Charlotte drove, Grace watched the city landscape gradually transform from sleek skyscrapers to suburban developments, and eventually to the rolling countryside that surrounded Millfield. According to her research, the town of 30,000 residents had a strong community feel, a respectable school system, and a growing arts scene, making it the perfect place for her cover identity as a creative professional seeking a quieter lifestyle. The house Charlotte had secured was on Maple Street, a tree-lined avenue of well-maintained older homes. It was a far cry from Grace's penthouse, but as they pulled into the driveway of the pale blue bungalow with white trim and a small front porch, Grace felt an unexpected flutter of excitement. "It's charming," she said, admiring the neatly tended garden and the way the afternoon sunlight dappled through the maple trees that gave the street its name. "It's 700 square feet," Charlotte replied dryly. "Your master bathroom at the penthouse is bigger." Grace laughed. "Exactly! Isn't it wonderful?" Charlotte shook her head, but couldn't entirely suppress a smile as she helped carry Grace's modest luggage inside. The interior of the house was clean and updated, if not luxurious. Hardwood floors, simple furniture, walls painted in soothing neutrals. Grace wandered from room to room, taking it all in with genuine appreciation. The neighbors seem friendly, Charlotte noted, unpacking groceries in the small but functional kitchen. "The woman next door brought over a plate of cookies when I was setting things up yesterday. Said her name was Margaret and invited the new neighbor to a community barbecue next weekend." "Perfect," Grace said, picking up a framed photograph of herself with her parents, one of the few personal items she'd brought. It had been taken on her 10th birthday, long before her mother's illness and her father's subsequent immersion in work. They looked happy, normal, just a family celebrating together, their wealth not immediately apparent in the casual setting of their lakeside cabin. "I've created a portfolio website for your design business," Charlotte continued, efficiently organizing the kitchen cabinets. "Nothing too flashy, but with enough clients and testimonials to seem established. If anyone checks, the phone numbers route to our system, and we have people ready to provide references." Grace nodded, moving to the window that overlooked the backyard. It was modest, but private, with a small patio and garden beds waiting to be planted. "I think I'll grow vegetables," she mused. "I've always wanted to try gardening." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "You've never even kept a houseplant alive, Miss Morgan." "Grace," she corrected gently. "Just Grace now. And Grace Williams is going to be excellent at gardening, among other things." After going through the final details of her new identity and reviewing their communication protocols, Grace saw Charlotte to the door. The reality of what she was doing suddenly hit her as she watched her assistant, her last tangible connection to her real life, prepare to leave. "You can call me any time," Charlotte reminded her, "day or night. And if you want to end this experiment, just say the word. I can have you back in your penthouse within hours." Grace hugged her impulsively. "Thank you for understanding. Or at least, pretending to." After Charlotte's departure, Grace stood alone in the unfamiliar house, listening to the sounds of normal life all around her. Children playing somewhere down the street, a lawnmower humming, a dog barking. For the first time in years, no one was expecting anything from her. No board meetings, no charity galas, no social obligations. Just Grace, in a house that wasn't really hers, preparing to live a life that wasn't really hers either. She spent that first evening exploring her new neighborhood on foot, marveling at the simple pleasure of anonymity. No one stared or whispered as she passed. No paparazzi lurked behind trees, hoping to catch the heiress in an unflattering moment. She was just another face, another person enjoying the warm summer evening. The next morning, following her plan to integrate into the community, Grace visited the local coffee shop, a cozy establishment called Brewful Thinking. The atmosphere was welcoming, with mismatched furniture and local artwork adorning the walls. She ordered a simple coffee and settled at a small table with her laptop, playing the part of the freelance designer at work. "Mind if I sit here? Every other table is taken." Grace looked up to find a man gesturing to the empty chair across from her. He was tall, with dark hair and kind eyes the color of strong coffee. Handsome in an understated way, wearing a button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled to reveal tanned forearms. Something about his direct gaze made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Please," she said, moving her bag to make room. "I don't mind sharing." "Thanks." He set down his cup and a small plate with a blueberry muffin. "I'm Edward, by the way. Edward Sullivan." "Grace," she replied, deliberately omitting her last name as Samuel had advised. "Grace Williams." "Nice to meet you, Grace Williams." His smile was warm and genuine. "Are you new in town? I don't think I've seen you here before, and I'm something of a regular." Grace nodded, closing her laptop. "Just moved in yesterday, actually. Maple Street." "Welcome to Millfield, then," Edward said. "What brings you to our little corner of nowhere special?" "A change of pace," Grace answered truthfully. "I'm a graphic designer. I can work from anywhere, and I wanted somewhere real, less hectic than the city." Edward nodded appreciatively. "I understand that completely. There's something to be said for small-town living. People know each other here. They look out for one another." Their conversation flowed easily, touching on favorite books, movies, and local recommendations. Edward, she learned, managed his family's business, a regional chain of upscale grocery stores called Sullivan Fresh Market. He spoke about it with a mixture of pride and resignation that piqued Grace's interest. "It sounds like you have complicated feelings about your work," she observed, after he described his recent efforts to source more products from local farmers. Edward's expression turned thoughtful. "The business has been in my family for 2 generations. My grandfather started with one small store, and my parents expanded it into 14 locations across 3 counties. It's a good business, honest work. But it wasn't your dream," Grace finished for him. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. A moment of recognition, of seeing and being seen. "No," he admitted. "I studied architecture in college, had plans to design sustainable housing. Then my father had his first heart attack and, well, family comes first." Grace felt a pang of empathy, remembering her own abrupt transition into leadership after her father's death. "Do you still design? As a hobby, maybe?" Edward's face brightened. "I have a drafting table set up in my garage. Nothing fancy, but I tinker with ideas sometimes." He glanced at his watch and sighed. "Speaking of work, I should get going. Morning inventory waits for no man." As he stood to leave, he hesitated. "Would you—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "There's a farmer's market on Thursday evenings in the town square. Local produce, artisans, some food trucks. It's nothing fancy, but it gives you a good feel for the community. Would you like to go? I could show you around, introduce you to some people. Grace felt a flutter of excitement that had nothing to do with her elaborate ruse and everything to do with the genuine interest in Edward's eyes. "I'd like that," she said simply. "Great." His smile widened. "I'll meet you there at 6? By the fountain in the center of the square?" "Perfect," Grace agreed, returning his smile. As Edward left, Grace sipped her coffee, watching him through the window as he crossed the street. For the first time since hatching her plan, she felt a twinge of guilt about her deception. Edward seemed sincere, honest, exactly the kind of person she had hoped to meet. But would he still look at her the same way if he knew the truth about who she really was? She pushed the thought aside. This was just a casual outing between new acquaintances, nothing more. And yet, as she turned back to her laptop, she couldn't help but feel that something significant had just begun. The farmers' market exceeded Grace's expectations. The town square had been transformed into a vibrant marketplace, with stalls displaying everything from heirloom tomatoes to handcrafted jewelry. String lights hung between trees, casting a warm glow as the summer evening settled over Millfield. Local musicians played acoustic guitars near the central fountain, where Edward waited as promised. He spotted her before she saw him, and the genuine pleasure that lit up his face sent an unexpected warmth through Grace's chest. "You came," he said, as if he'd half expected her to change her mind. "I said I would," Grace replied with a smile, suddenly conscious of her casual attire, jeans and a simple blouse that cost a fraction of what she would have spent on an outfit in her previous life. She'd deliberated longer than she cared to admit over what to wear, reminding herself that Grace Williams couldn't afford designer labels. "Let me give you the grand tour," Edward offered, gesturing toward the bustling market. "It won't take long. Millfield's idea of grand is fairly modest." They wandered through the market together, Edward greeting vendors by name and introducing Grace as Millfield's newest resident. Everyone welcomed her warmly, several insisting she sample their wares: a slice of sourdough bread, a wedge of artisanal cheese, a sweet strawberry still warm from the afternoon sun. "The Sullivan family has been coming to this market since before I was born," Edward explained as they paused at a honey vendor's stall. "My mother used to bring me here as a kid. I'd get to choose one treat if I behaved during her shopping." "And did you? Behave, I mean?" Grace asked, amused by the image of a young Edward trying to be on his best behavior. "Not always," he admitted with a laugh, "but my mother has always had a soft spot for me. I'm her only child, and she tends to be protective." Something in his tone caught Grace's attention. "Protective how?" Edward hesitated, then sighed. "Let's just say she has very specific ideas about the company I should keep, especially when it comes to dating." Grace nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "Ah, she wants you to find someone from the right sort of family?" "Exactly," Edward confirmed, looking slightly embarrassed. "Someone who understands our position in the community, as she puts it, preferably from another successful business family, with the right connections and background." Grace felt a knot form in her stomach. The irony wasn't lost on her. In her real identity, she would likely meet all of Edward's mother's criteria, and then some. As Grace Williams, however, she would be precisely the kind of woman Diane Sullivan would disapprove of. "And what do you want?" she asked quietly. Edward's expression softened as he looked at her. "Someone real. Someone who cares more about who I am than what my family owns." The simple honesty in his answer made Grace's heart ache. It was exactly what she herself had been searching for, what had driven her to this elaborate charade in the first place. They continued their stroll, stopping to watch a group of children dancing to a fiddler's lively tune. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on childhood memories, favorite books, and dreams for the future. Grace was careful to keep her stories aligned with her cover identity, But she found she could be truthful about many things: her love of art, her desire to create something meaningful, her hopes of someday having a family of her own. "Hungry?" Edward asked as they passed a row of food trucks. "Taco Mike makes the best fish tacos this side of the Mississippi." Grace laughed. "That's quite a claim. I'll have to judge for myself." They shared a meal at a picnic table, their knees occasionally brushing underneath, sending small electric currents through Grace. There was something so refreshingly straightforward about Edward. No pretense, no agenda, just genuine interest and easy conversation. "Edward! What a lovely surprise!" The sharp, cultured voice cut through their conversation like a knife. Grace looked up to see an elegant woman approaching their table, her silvery blonde hair perfectly styled, her linen dress and pearl necklace screaming old money. Even without Edward's sudden tension, Grace would have recognized Diane Sullivan from her striking resemblance to her son, the same dark eyes, though hers were cooler, more calculating. "Mother," Edward said, standing to greet her with a quick kiss on the cheek. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Clearly," Diane replied, her gaze sliding to Grace with polite curiosity that didn't quite mask her assessment. "And who might this be?" "This is Grace Williams," Edward said. "She just moved to town." "Grace, this is my mother, Diane Sullivan." Grace stood and extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sullivan." Diane's handshake was brief, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Welcome to Millfield, Miss Williams. What brings you to our little community?" "Grace is a graphic designer," Edward answered before Grace could speak. "She moved here from the city for a change of pace." "How interesting," Diane said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "And what sort of work do you do exactly? Corporate clients? Advertising agencies?" Grace maintained her pleasant expression, recognizing the interrogation for what it was. "Mostly independent projects. Book covers, brand identities for small businesses, that sort of thing." "Freelance," Diane clarified, the slight emphasis making the word sound vaguely disreputable. "How flexible." "Mother," Edward warned quietly. Diane smiled brightly, ignoring her son's discomfort. "You simply must join us for dinner at the house sometime, Miss Williams. I'd love to hear more about your work. Perhaps next Sunday. We always have a family dinner." The invitation was clearly a challenge, not a genuine offer of hospitality. Grace recognized the tactic. She'd seen similar maneuvers in corporate boardrooms, opponents extending seemingly friendly overtures designed to test and evaluate. "That sounds lovely," Grace replied smoothly. "Thank you for the invitation." Edward shot her a look of surprise mixed with admiration. Clearly, he hadn't expected her to accept. "Wonderful," Diane said, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Edward can give you the details. Now, I really must run. I'm meeting the committee for the hospital fundraiser." She turned to her son. "Don't forget, you're presenting the quarterly numbers to the board tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp. I'll be there," Edward assured her. With a final assessing glance at Grace, Diane departed, her posture perfect as she navigated through the crowd. "I'm sorry about that," Edward said once his mother was out of earshot. "She can be a bit intimidating," Grace suggested. "I was going to say intrusive, but yes, that too." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't have to come to dinner. I know it wasn't a genuine invitation." Grace found herself reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Actually, I'd like to come. Unless you'd rather I didn't?" The relief in Edward's eyes was immediate. "No, I'd like you to come. I just don't want you to feel ambushed. Sunday dinners at the Sullivan house can be intense. My mother considers them an opportunity to discuss business and conduct subtle interrogations of any new acquaintances." "I think I can handle it," Grace assured him, unable to suppress a small smile at the irony. If only he knew how many high-pressure business dinners she had navigated as CEO of Morgan Enterprises. As the evening drew to a close, Edward walked Grace back to her house on Maple Street. The streetlights cast a gentle glow on the tree-lined avenue, and the scent of jasmine hung in the warm night air. "I had a really good time tonight," Edward said, as they reached her front porch. "Thank you for braving both the farmer's market and my mother in one evening." Grace laughed. "I enjoyed myself too, even the surprise interrogation." They stood facing each other in the soft porch light, a moment of expectant silence stretching between them. Edward took a half-step closer, then hesitated. "I'd like to see you again," he said quietly. "Before the Sunday dinner gauntlet, I mean." "I'd like that too," Grace replied, surprised by how much she meant it. "How about Saturday? There's a nice hiking trail just outside town, along the river. Nothing strenuous, more of a nature walk, really. We could pack a lunch." "That sounds perfect." Edward smiled, relief and pleasure mingling in his expression. For a moment, Grace thought he might kiss her, but instead, he squeezed her hand gently. "Good night, Grace Williams," he said, his voice warm. "Welcome to Millfield." As Grace watched him walk back down the path, she felt a flutter of both excitement and unease. This evening had been exactly what she'd hoped for when she crafted her plan. A genuine connection, free from the complications of wealth and status. But she hadn't anticipated meeting someone like Edward so quickly, nor feeling such an immediate attraction. Inside her borrowed home, Grace kicked off her shoes and sank onto the comfortable but unremarkable sofa. Her phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte, their prearranged daily check-in. Grace responded with their code phrase indicating all was well, then sat in the quiet house, contemplating the unexpected turn her experiment had taken. The weekend arrived with perfect summer weather. Grace and Edward's Saturday hike was relaxed and comfortable, as if they'd known each other far longer than a few days. They talked about everything and nothing: favorite childhood memories, dream travel destinations, the small pleasures of everyday life. Grace was careful to maintain her cover story, but she found she could share many genuine details of her personality and interests without revealing her true identity. "So, fair warning about tomorrow," Edward said, as they sat on a blanket beside the river, sharing sandwiches and fresh fruit. "My mother has invited half the town's business elite to dinner. She always does this when she wants to. Evaluate someone new." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying I'm being set up for a public inspection?" Edward winced. "I'm saying my mother is transparent in her methods, if not her motives. She wants to see how you handle yourself in what she considers our social circle." "And how often does she do this?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. "Not often," he admitted. "I don't usually bring anyone home." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Grace felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "Well, I'll try not to embarrass you," she said lightly. Edward's expression turned serious. "You couldn't. It's my mother who should worry about embarrassing me." Sunday arrived too quickly. Grace spent longer than usual selecting her outfit, finally settling on a simple navy blue dress that Charlotte had included in her new wardrobe. Tasteful, but not expensive-looking, appropriate for a family dinner without appearing as though she were trying too hard. Edward picked her up promptly at 4 o'clock, looking handsome if slightly tense in khakis and a light blue button-down shirt. "Ready for the lion's den?" he asked as he opened the car door for her. "That bad?" Grace laughed. "You have no idea." The Sullivan family home was exactly what Grace had expected. A large colonial-style house set back from the road on manicured grounds, with a circular driveway and formal gardens. It spoke of old money and established position, though Grace noted it was perhaps a quarter the size of her family's estate outside the city. Diane greeted them at the door, impeccably dressed in a designer outfit that Grace recognized from the previous season's collection, something she herself might have worn to a casual business lunch. "Edward, darling, and Miss Williams, how lovely you could join us." Diane's smile was practiced, her handshake brief. "Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Sullivan," Grace replied. "You have a beautiful home." "Oh, we've been here for 20 years, Diane said, leading them through a formal foyer into a spacious living room where several people were already gathered with drinks. "The property has been in the Sullivan family for 3 generations. though we've made significant improvements." Grace recognized the statement for what it was, a declaration of established wealth and position. She had heard similar comments countless times at social functions, usually from those most concerned with asserting their status. "Everyone. You know Edward, of course. And this is his friend, Miss Grace Williams. She's new to Millfield. A graphic designer, I understand." The subtle emphasis on friend and graphic designer wasn't lost on Grace, nor was the slight pause before each term. She smiled pleasantly as Edward introduced her to the assembled guests: a bank president and his wife, the owner of a local construction company, a retired judge, and several other prominent community members. Last to be introduced was Edward's father, George Sullivan, a quiet man with kind eyes that reminded Grace of his son's. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Williams," George said, his handshake firm and genuine. "Don't let Diane intimidate you. Her bark is worse than her bite." "George," Diane chided, though there was an undercurrent of affection in her voice that surprised Grace. "Miss Williams will think we're uncivilized." Dinner was served in a formal dining room, complete with crystal, silver, and fine china. Grace noticed Diane watching closely as she navigated the place setting, clearly expecting her to be intimidated or confused by the formal arrangement. Little did she know that Grace had dined with heads of state and royalty, navigating far more complex etiquette with ease. Throughout the meal, Diane orchestrated the conversation to highlight the Sullivans' position and connections, while subtly probing Grace's background. Where had she studied? What brought her to Millfield specifically? Did she have family in the area? Did she find the freelance lifestyle stable? Grace answered each question with composed honesty, revealing only what aligned with her cover story. She was beginning to understand Edward's complicated relationship with his mother. Diane clearly loved her son deeply, but seemed determined to manage every aspect of his life, including his romantic interests. "Edward tells me you're quite talented, Miss Williams," Diane said as dessert was served. "Perhaps you might be interested in refreshing some of our store branding. Pro bono work can be so valuable for building a portfolio, don't you think?" Grace felt Edward tense beside her, but maintained her pleasant expression. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Sullivan, but I'm fortunate enough to have a full client roster at the moment. My portfolio is quite robust." "I see," Diane replied, her smile tightening. How fortunate indeed. As the evening progressed, Grace became increasingly aware of the subtle power play unfolding. Diane Sullivan was accustomed to being the wealthiest, most influential woman in any room, a position Grace herself often occupied in her real life. The irony wasn't lost on her. When the guests began to depart, Edward suggested they step outside for some fresh air. They walked to a garden terrace, where the evening stars were just beginning to appear in the twilight sky. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "My mother can be protective," Grace finished for him. "She loves you. She wants what she thinks is best for you." Edward shook his head. "What she wants is control. She's always been this way, but it's gotten worse since my father's heart attack 2 years ago. Now she's determined to manage both the business and my personal life with an iron fist." Grace thought of her own father, of the expectations that had shaped her life. Parents sometimes forget that loving someone means letting them make their own choices, even mistakes. Edward looked at her with newfound interest. "You're not what my mother expected, you know." "Oh? And what did she expect?" "Someone easily intimidated. Someone impressed by the Sullivan name and fortune." He smiled wryly. "Someone who wouldn't hold her own at a table full of the local elite." Grace felt a pang of guilt. She wasn't exactly holding her own as Grace Williams. She was drawing on all the experience and confidence of Grace Morgan, billionaire CEO. But the genuine admiration in Edward's eyes made the deception suddenly uncomfortable. "Edward, she began, then stopped. What could she say? That she understood Diane's protective instincts because she herself had been pursued for her wealth? That she was hiding behind a false identity to find someone who loved her for herself? "You don't have to explain," Edward said, misinterpreting her hesitation. "I know my mother can be overwhelming, but I want you to know that I don't share her priorities." He stepped closer, his eyes holding hers in the deepening twilight. "I've known you less than a week, Grace Williams, but there's something about you that feels right. I can't explain it better than that." The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. This was exactly what she had hoped to find. A genuine connection untainted by wealth or status. And yet, their entire relationship was built on a foundation of deception. How could anything real grow from that? Before she could resolve her internal conflict, Edward leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as she responded. For a moment, Grace forgot everything. Her true identity, her elaborate ruse, the complications that lay ahead. There was only this moment, this connection, this man whose honesty and warmth had caught her completely off guard. When they finally pulled apart, Edward looked slightly dazed. "I've been wanting to do that since the farmer's market," he admitted. Grace smiled, pushing her concerns aside for the moment. "I'm glad you finally did." Later, as Edward drove her home through the quiet streets of Millfield, Grace found herself at a crossroads. The sensible thing would be to distance herself now, before either of them became more invested. She had come here to experience normal life, not to entangle herself in a relationship founded on falsehood. Yet, as Edward walked her to her door and kissed her goodnight, his eyes full of promise and genuine affection, Grace couldn't bring herself to pull away. For the first time in her adult life, someone was looking at her, seeing her, without the distorting lens of wealth and power, even if that someone didn't know her real name. Over the next few weeks, Grace's life settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and unexpectedly satisfying. She maintained her cover as a freelance designer, actually completing several small projects that Charlotte forwarded to her from legitimate clients seeking Morgan Enterprises design services. During regular encrypted video calls with Samuel, she reviewed essential business matters requiring her attention. But for the most part, Grace Morgan's empire continued functioning smoothly without her physical presence. Meanwhile, Grace Williams blossomed in Millfield. She joined a local book club, volunteered at the community garden, and became a regular at Brewful Thinking, where she often worked on her laptop while exchanging friendly greetings with the baristas, who now knew her order by heart. For the first time since childhood, she experienced the simple pleasure of being unremarkable, just another face in the crowd, valued for her contributions and personality rather than her wealth or influence. And then there was Edward. Their relationship deepened with surprising speed, as if making up for lost time. They saw each other nearly every day, casual dinners at local restaurants, walks through the historic district, quiet evenings watching old movies on Grace's modest television. Edward proved to be thoughtful, intelligent, and refreshingly unpretentious, despite his privileged upbringing. He spoke passionately about sustainable business practices and his dream of eventually incorporating his architectural interests into redesigning the Sullivan stores to be more environmentally friendly. "My mother thinks it's wasteful," he explained one evening as they sat on Grace's back porch, sharing a bottle of wine under the stars. "She sees only the upfront costs, not the long-term benefits, financial or ethical." "And your father?" Grace asked, curling her legs beneath her on the porch swing. Edward's expression softened. "Dad understands better. He built this business with genuine care for the community. Mother was the one who pushed for rapid expansion, for being bigger and more profitable than anyone else in the region." Grace nodded, understanding the dynamic all too well. Her own father had faced similar tensions with some of his board members who constantly pushed for faster growth at the expense of Morgan Enterprises' ethical standards. "You should show them the numbers," she suggested. "Sustainability isn't just ethical. It's becoming economically essential. Consumer preferences are shifting. Brands with genuine environmental commitments command higher loyalty and can justify premium pricing." Edward looked at her with surprise. That's exactly right. How do you know so much about retail market trends? Grace felt a flutter of panic, realizing she'd spoken from her executive experience rather than her cover identity. I've designed for several eco-conscious brands, she improvised quickly. Part of effective design is understanding the market positioning. Edward seemed to accept this explanation, but the moment left Grace unsettled. These slips were becoming more frequent as she grew comfortable with Edward. Casual references to business principles or financial concepts that would be unusual for someone of Grace Williams's background. The truth was, she was falling in love with him, and with every passing day, her deception weighed more heavily on her conscience. "I should show you my designs sometime," Edward said, unaware of her inner turmoil. "I've been working on some concepts for retrofitting our flagship store. Nothing that will ever see the light of day, probably, but it helps me stay connected to that part of myself. I'd love to see them," Grace replied sincerely. He kissed her then, tenderly at first, then with increasing passion. Grace responded eagerly, her body melting against his, all thoughts of deception temporarily forgotten. This, at least, was entirely genuine. The chemistry between them, the growing emotional connection that made her heart race whenever he was near. When Edward finally pulled away, his eyes were dark with desire and something deeper, more significant. "I'm falling for you, Grace Williams," he said softly, harder and faster than I ever thought possible. The words sent both joy and panic coursing through her. She wanted to reciprocate, to tell him she felt the same. But how could she, when he didn't even know her real name? "Edward," she began, steeling herself for what needed to be said. "There's something The sharp ring of his phone interrupted her. Edward glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's the store. The night manager wouldn't call this late, unless it was important," he answered, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he listened. "I'll be right there," he said finally, ending the call. "I'm sorry, Grace. There's been a break-in at the flagship store. Nothing major stolen, but there's significant damage to the office areas. I need to go." "Of course," Grace said, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Edward kissed her quickly before departing, promising to call the next day. As Grace watched his car disappear down Maple Street, she wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly chilled despite the warm evening. She needed to tell him the truth, soon. The following morning, Grace woke to her secure phone, buzzing with a priority alert from Samuel. She answered immediately, concerned by the unusual timing. "Miss Morgan," Samuel's voice was tense. "We have a situation. Someone's been making inquiries about your whereabouts." Grace sat up straight, fully alert. "What kind of inquiries?" "Who?" "A private investigator based in Millfield. Very discreet, but one of our security protocols flagged unusual search patterns focusing on your recent activities. They're specifically investigating whether you're currently living under an assumed identity." Grace's blood ran cold. "Do we know who hired them?" "Not definitively, but the investigator has done work for Sullivan Fresh Market in the past." Diane Sullivan. It had to be. Their background check on Edward's mother had revealed a woman obsessed with social climbing and protecting her family's position. She would not accept her only son becoming involved with someone she considered beneath their station. "What specifically are they looking into?" Grace asked, her mind racing. "Your educational background, employment history. They've requested records from the design school listed on Grace Williams's resume, records that didn't exist. Her cover identity would withstand casual scrutiny, but not a professional investigation." "We need to shut this down," Grace said firmly. "Use whatever legal means necessary to block their access to any information. And Samuel, I need to know exactly what they've discovered so far." After ending the call, Grace paced her small living room, weighing her options. She could maintain the deception, using Morgan Enterprises' considerable resources to reinforce her cover identity. But that would only delay the inevitable. Sooner or later, Diane would discover the truth, that Grace Williams didn't exist. Or she could tell Edward everything. Now, before someone else did. The thought terrified her. What if he felt betrayed? What if he believed their entire relationship was some bizarre game played by a bored heiress? Would he understand that her deception had been born of a genuine desire to find someone who valued her for herself, not her fortune? Before she could resolve her dilemma, her phone rang. Edward's name flashed on the screen. "Good morning," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Grace?" Something in his tone immediately alerted her that something was wrong. "We need to talk. Can I come over?" 20 minutes later, Edward's car pulled into her driveway. Grace watched from the window as he sat motionless behind the wheel for several long moments, before finally emerging. His face was composed but serious as she opened the door. "Edward, what's wrong?" He stepped inside but remained standing in her small entryway, maintaining an unusual distance between them. "My mother hired someone to look into your background." Grace's heart sank. "I see. Do you?" His voice was controlled, but she could hear the hurt beneath it. "Because I've spent all night trying to understand why the design school you claim to attend has no record of a Grace Williams matching your age and description, or why the client testimonials on your website all lead to shell companies, or why there seems to be no trace of you before 6 weeks ago." Grace closed her eyes briefly, gathering her courage. "Edward, I can explain. Please do." He crossed his arms, waiting. Where to begin? How to make him understand a decision that now seemed impulsive and ill-considered in the harsh light of reality? "My name isn't Grace Williams," she said finally, deciding that simple truth was the only path forward. "It's Grace Morgan." Edward's brow furrowed. "As in? Morgan Enterprises." "Yes." She gestured for him to sit, relieved when he reluctantly took a seat on her sofa. "I'm not a freelance designer. I'm the CEO and majority shareholder of Morgan Enterprises." Edward stared at her in disbelief. "The technology and real estate conglomerate? That Morgan Enterprises?" Grace nodded. "My father founded the company. When he died 3 years ago, I took over. And you're living in Millfield because—" Edward's confusion was giving way to something harder, more guarded. "Because I wanted to experience life without the complications of extreme wealth," Grace explained, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "My entire adult life, I've been pursued for my money, my status, my connections, never for myself. I wanted to know if I could form genuine connections based on who I am, not what I own. So this was, what? Some kind of social experiment? A wealthy woman slumming it in a small town for kicks?" The hurt in his voice cut through her. "No, Edward, it wasn't like that. I never expected to meet someone like you, to feel this way so quickly. And how exactly do you feel, Grace? Or whatever your name really is?" He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "How am I supposed to believe anything you say when our entire relationship has been based on a lie?" Grace moved toward him, desperate to make him understand. "Not everything was a lie. Not the things that matter. How I feel about you. That's real. More real than anything I've felt in years." Edward looked at her, his expression a complex mixture of hurt, anger, and confusion. "Do you have any idea how this feels? To discover the person I've been falling in love with doesn't even exist?" "I exist," Grace said quietly. "I'm still the same person you've spent time with these past weeks. I just have a different name, a different job, a different life," Edward corrected. "A completely different life that you deliberately hid from me while I shared everything with you. My hopes, my frustrations, my family complications, all while you were playing a role." Grace flinched at the accuracy of his words. "It started that way," she admitted. "But somewhere along the line, it stopped being an experiment or a role. It became real, Edward. You became real to me in a way no one else ever has." Edward shook his head, his expression closing off. "I need time to process this. I don't even know what to think right now." "I understand," Grace said, fighting back tears, "but please believe me when I say I never meant to hurt you. The closer we became, the more I realized I needed to tell you the truth. I was going to tell you last night, before the call about the break-in. Convenient timing, Edward remarked, his tone uncharacteristically bitter. It's true, Grace insisted. Ask yourself, why would I maintain this deception if my feelings for you weren't genuine? I have nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling you who I really am. Edward was silent for a long moment, considering her words. Finally, he sighed heavily. I believe you didn't intend to hurt me, but that doesn't change the fact that you did. I need space, Grace. Time to think. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. For what it's worth, I understand why you might want to escape the pressures of wealth and status. But relationships, real relationships, are built on trust. And right now, I don't know if I can trust you. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that somehow hurt more than a slam would have. Grace sank onto the sofa, allowing the tears she'd been holding back to finally fall. She had gambled everything on this deception, and now she was facing the consequences. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to find someone who would love her for herself rather than her wealth, she had potentially lost the very person who might have done exactly that. The next few days passed in a blur of misery. Grace threw herself into work, using her secured laptop to handle Morgan Enterprises' business that had been accumulating during her absence. She welcomed the distraction, the complex problems that required her full concentration, and left no room for dwelling on personal regrets. Edward didn't call. Grace respected his request for space, though every hour without contact felt like an eternity. She considered returning to the city, abandoning her experiment now that its fundamental premise had been compromised. But something kept her in Millfield. Hope, perhaps, or simply the need to face the consequences of her actions. On the fourth day after their confrontation, Grace was working at her dining table when a sharp knock at the door startled her. Her heart leapt with hope, but when she opened the door, it wasn't Edward who stood on her porch. It was Diane Sullivan. The older woman looked as immaculate as ever in a designer pantsuit, her silver blonde hair perfectly styled, her expression a mask of cold fury. "Mrs. Sullivan," Grace said, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't," Diane replied, her voice brittle. "May I come in? What I have to say shouldn't be overheard by the neighbors." Grace stepped aside, allowing Edward's mother to enter. Diane surveyed the modest house with undisguised disdain before turning her attention back to Grace. "I know who you are," she said, without preamble. "Grace Morgan, daughter of James Morgan, current CEO of Morgan Enterprises. Net worth estimated at $4.6 billion, according to last quarter's financial reports. Your investigator was thorough," Grace acknowledged, maintaining her composure. "What I don't know," Diane continued as if Grace hadn't spoken, "is what game you're playing with my son. It's not a game, Mrs. Sullivan. I genuinely care for Edward." Diane's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Please, women like us don't play at being poor without an agenda. What is it you want? Information on our business? Some twisted thrill? Or is my son just an amusing diversion for a bored billionaire?" The accusation stung precisely because it touched on Grace's own doubts about her actions. "You misunderstand my motives. I wanted to experience genuine connection without the distortion of extreme wealth." "How noble," Diane said sarcastically. "And in the process, you toyed with my son's emotions, made him believe he was falling in love with someone who doesn't exist." "Grace Williams is who I am without the trappings of wealth," Grace insisted. "The connection between Edward and me is real." Diane stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous softness. "Let me be perfectly clear, Miss Morgan. You will end this charade immediately. You will leave Millfield and never contact my son again." Grace felt a surge of indignation. "With all due respect, Mrs. Sullivan, that decision isn't yours to make. It's between Edward and me. Is it?" Diane pulled an envelope from her handbag and tossed it onto the dining table. Perhaps these will change your mind. Grace opened the envelope with growing dread. Inside were photographs, professionally shot, expertly edited, showing what appeared to be Grace in compromising positions with an unidentifiable man. The timestamp on the images showed dates when she had been with Edward. "These are fake," Grace said, her voice shaking with anger. "I was with Edward on these dates. You've fabricated evidence to make it look like I was unfaithful." Diane's smile was cold. "Prove it. In the meantime, Edward will receive these tomorrow morning unless you're gone from Millfield by tonight. End things cleanly, and these photos disappear. Continue this farce, and I'll make sure my son sees exactly the kind of woman you really are." "You would hurt your own son with lies just to control his life?" Grace was genuinely shocked by the lengths Diane would go to. "I'm protecting him from a manipulative woman who's been lying to him since the day they met." Diane adjusted her purse strap, preparing to leave. "You have until morning, Miss Morgan. Don't underestimate me." After Diane's departure, Grace sat motionless at her dining table, staring at the fabricated photos. The manipulation was expertly done. Without knowing her own whereabouts on the dates in question, even she might have been convinced by the images. She had encountered corporate espionage, hostile takeover attempts, and ruthless competitors in her business life, but nothing had prepared her for this level of personal malice. Diane Sullivan was willing to devastate her own son emotionally to maintain control over his life. Grace's first instinct was to call Edward immediately, to warn him about his mother's scheme. But would he believe her? Their relationship was already damaged by her deception. How would it look if she now accused his mother of fabricating evidence without proof? No. She needed more than accusations. She needed evidence of Diane's manipulation and a plan to counter it. With sudden determination, Grace picked up her secure phone and called Samuel Reynolds. "Miss Morgan," he answered promptly. "How can I help you?" "Samuel," Grace said, her voice steady with resolve, "I need a team of our best digital forensic experts and private investigators in Millfield immediately. And contact Charlotte. I need her to bring me some things from my personal safe." It's time Grace Morgan made an appearance. The battle lines had been drawn. Diane Sullivan had severely underestimated her opponent, and Grace was about to show her exactly how costly that mistake would be. By sunset, Grace's modest rental home had transformed into an impromptu command center. Samuel Reynolds directed operations from the dining room table, surrounded by secure laptops and communication equipment. Two digital forensics experts occupied the living room, analyzing the fabricated photos for digital fingerprints that might reveal their creator. Charlotte had arrived with a carefully curated selection from Grace's wardrobe, pieces that projected quiet authority without ostentatious display of wealth. "The photos were professionally manipulated," reported Olivia, the lead forensics specialist. "High-end work, but we've identified several digital artifacts that prove tampering. The lighting angles don't match between your face and body in 3 of the images, and there's inconsistent pixel density around the edited areas." "True," Grace nodded, processing this information. "Can you trace who created them?" "We're working on it. The metadata has been stripped, but there are remnants suggesting they were edited on a subscription-based professional photo editing platform. If we can identify the account, do whatever's necessary," Grace authorized. "I want concrete proof of who commissioned these forgeries." Samuel cleared his throat. "Miss Morgan, I've completed the background review on Diane Sullivan you requested. There are several concerning findings." Grace joined him at the dining table, where he had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Edward's mother. "Show me." "Mrs. Sullivan has a pattern of interference in her son's relationships," Samuel explained, displaying a series of reports. "We've identified 3 previous instances where promising relationships ended abruptly after her intervention. In one case, 5 years ago, she orchestrated a job offer in another state for a woman Edward was dating seriously. And Edward never discovered his mother's involvement? Apparently not. She's quite skilled at manipulating situations while maintaining plausible deniability. Grace wasn't surprised. Diane Sullivan had struck her as someone accustomed to getting her way through whatever means necessary. What about her business practices? Anything problematic there? Samuel hesitated before sliding another folder toward her. This is where things become more serious. Sullivan Fresh Market presents itself as committed to community values and ethical sourcing. However, our investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic wage theft at several locations, manipulation of vendor contracts, and possibly questionable accounting practices designed to underreport profits. Grace leaned back, considering this information. Edward doesn't know, does he, about any of this? The operational structure suggests he's deliberately kept in the dark. His position as Chief Operations Officer gives him oversight of store management and customer experience, but financial operations and vendor relationships fall under his mother's direct control. This explained so much about the tension she'd observed between Edward and his mother regarding the business. He genuinely believed in the company's stated values, unaware that his mother was undermining them behind the scenes. What about George Sullivan? Is he involved in these practices? Samuel shook his head. It appears Mr. Sullivan has taken a largely ceremonial role since his heart attack 2 years ago. He attends board meetings and public functions, but has ceded operational control to his wife. A plan was forming in Grace's mind, not just to counter Diane's immediate threat with the fabricated photos, but to address the deeper dysfunction that had trapped Edward in an untenable position, torn between loyalty to his family business and his own ethical principles. Samuel, I need to see Edward. Tonight. Can you arrange it without alerting his mother? The lawyer nodded, already reaching for his phone. I believe so. He's currently at the flagship store, overseeing some security upgrades after the break-in. Perfect. Have a car ready in 30 minutes. And, Charlotte? Grace turned to her assistant. It's time for Grace Morgan to make her first public appearance in Millfield. As Charlotte helped her prepare, Grace reflected on the past 6 weeks. Her experiment in living as Grace Williams had given her something precious. A glimpse of life uncomplicated by extreme wealth, yes, but more importantly, a chance to connect with someone who valued her for her character, her humor, her mind. Now she needed to find out if that connection could survive the full truth. The Sullivan Fresh Market flagship store was located in a prime retail district on the edge of Millfield's historic downtown. Despite the late hour, lights still burned in the administrative offices above the store. Grace instructed her driver to wait as she entered through the employee entrance, her heart pounding with equal measures of determination and apprehension. A startled security guard intercepted her. "Ma'am, the store is closed. Staff only beyond this point." Grace offered a polite but firm smile. "I'm here to see Edward Sullivan. It's a personal matter of some urgency. I'll need to call up to the office." "That won't be necessary, Jim." Edward's voice came from the stairwell behind them. He looked tired, shadows beneath his eyes, suggesting he'd slept as poorly as Grace had since their confrontation. His expression revealed surprise at her appearance, not just her presence, but her transformed look. Gone was the casual attire of Grace Williams, replaced by the subtle but unmistakable polish of Grace Morgan, CEO. "Edward," she said softly, "I need to speak with you. Please." He hesitated only briefly before nodding. "We can talk in my office." Grace followed him up the stairs in silence, acutely aware of the physical and emotional distance between them compared to the easy intimacy they'd shared just days earlier. Edward's office was modest but well-appointed, with large windows overlooking the town and, incongruously, an architect's drafting table in one corner. "Your designs?" Grace asked, nodding toward the table where detailed sketches of a building were visible. "Just a hobby," Edward replied, his tone guarded. "What did you want to discuss?" Grace took a deep breath. "Your mother came to see me today." Edward's expression hardened. What did she want? Instead of answering directly, Grace placed the envelope of forged photos on his desk. "She brought these. They're meant to show me being unfaithful to you during dates when we were actually together. They're expertly fabricated, Edward." She threatened to give them to you tomorrow morning unless I leave Millfield tonight and end our relationship. Edward stared at the envelope without opening it, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve the truth, all of it. Grace moved closer, willing him to look at her. I deceived you about my identity, and that was wrong. I should have trusted you with the truth once I realized my feelings for you were genuine. But your mother is deceiving you too, in ways that go far beyond these photos. His eyes finally met hers, wary but attentive. Explain. Sullivan Fresh Market isn't what you believe it to be. Grace proceeded carefully, knowing she was about to shatter his perception of his family legacy. Your mother has been engaging in business practices that directly contradict the values you think the company stands for. Wage theft, predatory vendor contracts, creative accounting to hide profits. That's a serious accusation, Edward said, his voice tight with tension. Do you have proof? Yes. Grace placed a thumb drive on the desk next to the envelope. Everything is documented here. My team has verified the information independently. Your team, Edward repeated, a hint of bitter irony in his voice. Of course you have a team. Edward, I know you're angry with me, and you have every right to be. But this isn't about us right now. It's about your mother being willing to manipulate and lie to both of us to maintain control. She's done it before, with other relationships you've had. Edward's expression shifted from skepticism to a dawning realization. Alexis, he murmured. She suddenly got that amazing job offer in Seattle. Your mother arranged it, Grace confirmed gently. There's a pattern, Edward. She isolates you from anyone she can't control, anyone who might challenge her authority over your life or reveal the truth about how she runs the business. Edward moved to the window, staring out at the town lights as he processed this information. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Even if what you're saying about the business is true, he finally said, why should I believe anything else from you? You've been lying to me from the moment we met. Not about everything, Grace replied, moving to stand beside him. Not about how I feel about you. Not about who I am, fundamentally. My name and my financial situation aren't the sum of my identity, Edward. Aren't they? He turned to face her. You're Grace Morgan, billionaire CEO. That shapes everything about your life, your choices, your perspective. How can you claim it doesn't define you? Because I've lived both lives now, Grace answered simply, and in the ways that matter most, how I treat people, what I value, what brings me joy. I'm the same person whether I'm Grace Williams or Grace Morgan. Edward studied her face, searching for truth. Why did you really come to Millfield? The whole truth this time. Grace met his gaze steadily. After my father died, I threw myself into running his company. I excelled at it, but something was missing. Every relationship I had felt transactional. Every potential partner seemed more interested in what I represented than who I was. I started to wonder if I would ever find someone who saw me, just me, without the distorting lens of extreme wealth. So you created Grace Williams? Yes. It was supposed to be a temporary experiment, living simply, anonymously, to see if I could form genuine connections based solely on my character and personality. I never expected to meet someone like you so quickly, never anticipated falling in love. The words hung in the air between them, a truth she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. You love me, Edward said, not quite a question. I do, Grace admitted, which is why I can't leave Millfield based on your mother's threats. I can't walk away from what we might have without fighting for it. But I also won't lie to you anymore about anything. Edward closed his eyes briefly, his expression pained. I need time, Grace, to process everything. The photos, the business allegations, your real identity. It's too much to absorb all at once. I understand, Grace said, though her heart ached at the continued distance between them. Take whatever time you need. But please, look at the evidence before you speak with your mother. And know that whatever you decide about us, I want what's best for you." As she turned to leave, Edward's voice stopped her at the door. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I fell in love with the woman who talked passionately about design principles, who volunteered at the community garden even though she clearly had no idea what she was doing, who listened to my dreams without judgment. If that woman is the real you, then maybe there's something worth salvaging here." Grace offered a small, hopeful smile. "She is the real me, the most real I've ever been." The following morning, Grace woke early after a restless night. She had done all she could. The next move belonged to Edward. While waiting for word from him, she channeled her nervous energy into work, reviewing quarterly projections for Morgan Enterprises' tech division. The knock at her door came just after 10 o'clock. When she opened it, Edward stood on her porch, his expression grave but determined. "I reviewed everything," he said without preamble. "The photos, the business records, all of it." Grace nodded, her heart pounding. And I confronted my mother this morning." This wasn't what Grace had expected. "What happened?" Edward's laugh held no humor. "She denied everything at first. Then, when I showed her the evidence, she justified her actions. The business practices were necessary competitive measures. The manipulation of my relationships was maternal protection. She actually believes she's been acting in my best interest." "I'm sorry, Edward," Grace said softly, meaning it. Despite everything Diane had done, she was still his mother, and this revelation had clearly shaken him deeply. "Don't be. It needed to happen." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "I've been blind, Grace, willfully blind to who my mother really is, to what our family business has become under her leadership. What will you do now?" Edward's expression hardened with resolve. "I've called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. My father and I still control majority voting rights. We're going to address the ethical violations, implement new oversight measures, and make personnel changes where necessary." "Your mother won't take that well," Grace observed. "No, she won't, but it's not negotiable." Edward's voice softened. "My father was devastated by the evidence. He blames himself for stepping back after his heart attack, for not paying closer attention. He's determined to make things right." Grace stepped aside, inviting him in. "And what about us, Edward? Where do we stand?" He entered the house, but remained standing in the entryway, his expression troubled. "I'm still processing everything, Grace. The trust between us was broken. That can't be fixed overnight." "I know," she acknowledged, her heart sinking despite her understanding of his position. "But," Edward continued, his voice gentling, "I also know that what we shared was real. At least, it was real for me." "It was real for me, too," Grace assured him, hope flickering to life once more. "Every moment." Edward took a step toward her. "Then maybe we can start again. No more secrets, no more deceptions. Just Grace and Edward, getting to know each other honestly this time." Grace felt tears threatening. "I'd like that very much." "Good." Edward checked his watch reluctantly. "I need to go prepare for the board meeting, but dinner tonight? We can talk more then." "I'll be here," Grace promised. After Edward left, Grace contacted Samuel to update him on the situation. The lawyer seemed pleased with the developments, but cautioned her about potential fallout. "Diane Sullivan won't surrender control easily," he warned. "She may become more desperate, more vindictive when cornered." "I know," Grace acknowledged, "but Edward and his father are handling the business side. I need to stay focused on rebuilding trust between Edward and me." Samuel's expression softened with rare approval. "If I may say so, Miss Morgan, I believe your father would be proud of how you've handled this situation. Not just the business aspects, but the personal ones as well. He always hoped you would find someone who valued you for yourself, not your fortune." Grace smiled at the mention of her father. "Thank you, Samuel. That means a great deal to me." As she prepared for her dinner with Edward, Grace reflected on how differently her experiment had turned out from what she'd envisioned. She had sought anonymity, and found connection. She had escaped the burdens of wealth, only to discover that true freedom came not from hiding who she was, but from being fully, authentically herself with someone who saw her clearly. The journey ahead would not be simple. Trust, once broken, required patience and consistent truth to rebuild. Edward would need time to process everything that had happened, to reconcile the woman he had fallen in love with and the woman she truly was. And looming over them was the unpredictable threat of Diane Sullivan, a woman accustomed to power who now faced losing it. Yet for the first time in years, Grace felt genuinely hopeful about her future. Not as a billionaire CEO, not as a woman playing at ordinary life, but as herself, complete with flaws, strengths, and the capacity for genuine love. The evening stretched before her, full of possibility. Whatever happened next, Grace knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would face it as her authentic self, with courage and an open heart. The Sullivan Fresh Market boardroom crackled with tension. Edward stood at the head of the conference table, his father seated to his right, both men's expressions grim with determination. Around the table sat the other board members, longtime family friends and business associates who had watched the company grow from a single neighborhood store to a regional powerhouse under the Sullivan family's leadership. Diane Sullivan arrived last, sweeping into the room with the confident authority of someone unaccustomed to having her decisions questioned. She wore an elegant cream-colored suit, her silver blonde hair arranged in a perfect updo, diamonds glittering at her ears and throat. The picture of success and control. "What's this emergency about, Edward?" she asked, taking her customary seat opposite her husband. "I had to reschedule 3 important meetings today." Edward met his mother's gaze steadily. "This meeting is about the future of Sullivan Fresh Market, Mother. Specifically, about certain business practices that have come to light." Diane's expression flickered with momentary uncertainty before her composure reasserted itself. "What practices are you referring to?" Instead of answering directly, Edward distributed folders to each board member. "Please review these documents carefully. They detail systemic wage theft across multiple store locations, predatory vendor contracts designed to squeeze small local producers, and accounting irregularities that have concealed true profits from this board and from tax authorities." The room fell silent as the board members opened their folders. George Sullivan already knew what they contained. He had spent the morning reviewing the evidence with Edward. The others reacted with varying degrees of shock and dismay as they processed the information. "This is absurd," Diane declared, closing her folder without examining its contents. "Whatever these documents purport to show is either fabricated or grossly misinterpreted." "Edward, where did you get this misinformation?" "These records came from our own internal systems, Mother," Edward replied calmly. "Accounting data, payroll records, vendor contracts, all authenticated and verified by independent forensic accountants this morning." "Independent?" Diane latched onto the word. "Meaning what, exactly? Who's behind this witch hunt?" Edward ignored the question. "The evidence is clear. Under your direct oversight, this company has systematically underpaid workers, exploited vendors, and misreported financial data. These practices violate not only our stated company values, but potentially several laws." George Sullivan cleared his throat, speaking for the first time. "Diane, is this true? Have you authorized these practices?" Diane's eyes narrowed as she realized her husband wasn't supporting her. "George, this is ridiculous. I've made difficult business decisions to keep us competitive. Yes, every successful company operates this way." "No, they don't," Edward countered firmly. "Ethical businesses can be profitable without exploitation. You've betrayed everything this company was supposed to stand for, everything my grandfather built, everything Dad believed we were continuing." Diane's face hardened. "So now you're an expert on running this business? After spending years indulging your architectural fantasies while I handled the hard realities of keeping us profitable?" "This isn't about my interests outside the company," Edward replied, refusing to be baited. "This is about integrity, about honesty, two values that seem increasingly foreign to you, Mother, in business and in your personal conduct." The shift in topic was subtle, but unmistakable. Diane stiffened, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face. Edward continued, his voice steady. "While investigating these business practices, I also discovered evidence of your interference in my personal life. Fabricated photos, manipulated job offers to drive away women I cared about, systematic deception designed to control who I could be close to." Several board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling they were witnessing a family matter beyond their purview. But Edward wasn't finished. This pattern of behavior, the dishonesty, the manipulation, the willingness to harm others for personal gain, extends from your management of this company to your treatment of your own family. It ends today. Diane looked around the table, realizing she was isolated. "You can't possibly believe you can remove me from this company," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I built Sullivan Fresh Market into what it is today. Without me, you'd still be a single store struggling to compete with the national chains." "No one disputes your business acumen, Diane," George said gently. "But methods matter. Ethics matter. The company you've built isn't the one we thought we were running. And that's why the board will vote today on a new leadership structure," Edward added. "One with proper oversight, transparent accounting, and ethical treatment of employees and vendors as a non-negotiable priority." Diane's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "You need my shares to make any significant changes, and I will never vote to diminish my own authority in this company." "Actually," George interjected, "our family trust holds 51% of voting shares. Edward and I together control that trust. We don't need your approval, Diane." The color drained from Diane's face as she realized the extent of her miscalculation. "George, you wouldn't do this to me. After 36 years of marriage? After everything we've built together?" For a moment, George's resolve seemed to waver. He had loved this woman for most of his adult life, had built a family and a business with her. But when he spoke, his voice was firm despite its gentleness. "I'm not doing this to you, Diane. I'm doing it for our company, our employees, our community, and for our son, whom you've manipulated and deceived. Most of all, I'm doing it because it's right." The board meeting proceeded with clinical efficiency after that. Diane sat in rigid silence as the votes were tallied, as a new organizational structure was approved, as her direct oversight of financial operations was reassigned to a committee that would include independent auditors. She was not removed from the company entirely. She remained a major shareholder and board member, but her unilateral control had been decisively broken. As the meeting concluded, Diane stood abruptly. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at Edward. "You've made a serious mistake today. Both of you." Her gaze shifted to include her husband. Without waiting for a response, she gathered her belongings and left the room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Edward exchanged a concerned glance with his father. They had anticipated her anger, but the cold calculation in her eyes suggested she was already planning her counterattack. "She won't take this lying down," George said quietly once the other board members had filed out. "You know that, don't you?" Edward nodded. "I know, but we did what was necessary." "Your mother isn't evil, son," George sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. "She's driven, ambitious, protective in her own way. Somewhere along the line, those qualities twisted into something harder, more ruthless. I should have seen it happening. Should have intervened years ago." "Pete, we can't change the past," Edward replied, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "But we can build a better future for the company, for our family too, if Mother is willing to accept the changes. And if she isn't?" Edward had no answer for that. Later that evening, Edward arrived at Grace's home for their dinner, his expression weary but relieved. "It's done," he said as she welcomed him inside. The board voted unanimously for the restructuring once they saw the evidence. My mother has been removed from direct financial oversight. How did she take it? Grace asked, leading him to the small dining area where she had prepared a simple meal. Edward's laugh was mirthless. About as well as you'd expect. She's furious, humiliated, and already plotting her revenge, I'm sure. Against the company? Against me? Against us? Edward accepted the glass of wine Grace offered. She blames you for all of this, you know. She's convinced herself that you orchestrated everything to damage our family business. Grace nodded thoughtfully. It's easier for her to see me as a villain than to acknowledge her own actions. Exactly. Edward took a long sip of wine, then set the glass down with deliberate care. Grace, there's something I need to say. About us. Grace's heart skipped nervously. Despite his agreement to start fresh, his tone suggested complications ahead. I'm listening. When I discovered who you really were, I felt betrayed, manipulated. But today, watching my mother's reaction to being exposed, I realized something important. He met Grace's eyes directly. Your deception came from a place of vulnerability, wanting to be loved for yourself, not your wealth. Hers came from a place of control, wanting power over others, including me. Edward, please, let me finish, he said gently. I understand now why you created Grace Williams. And I understand that the woman I fell in love with, the intelligent, compassionate, occasionally stubborn woman who challenged me to think differently about business and sustainability, that woman is real, whether her name is Williams or Morgan. Grace felt tears threatening. She is real. She's the most authentic version of myself I've ever been able to be. Edward reached across the table to take her hand. Then that's who I want to build a relationship with. Not the billionaire CEO, not the fictional freelance designer, but you. Just you, with all your complexity and contradictions. Even knowing how much more complicated your life might become? Grace asked. Being with me means scrutiny, publicity, assumptions about your motives. Even then, Edward confirmed without hesitation, though I have to admit, it's a lot to process. My mother's been demonizing wealth disparity in relationships my entire life, just in the opposite direction from what we're facing. I've internalized more of that thinking than I realized. Grace laughed softly. So we're both bringing baggage to this relationship. That seems appropriately normal, doesn't it? Refreshingly so. Edward agreed with a smile that finally reached his eyes. They shared a quiet dinner, carefully navigating the delicate process of reintroduction. Grace Morgan getting to know Edward Sullivan without pretense or deception between them. They discussed their childhoods, their relationships with their parents, the pressures and privileges that had shaped them. Edward spoke candidly about his abandoned architectural dreams. Grace revealed her insecurities about living up to her father's legacy. Would you consider reviving your architectural work? Grace asked, as they cleared the dinner dishes together, a domestic task that felt surprisingly natural. Not necessarily leaving the family business, but perhaps finding a way to incorporate both passions? Edward considered this. Maybe. The restructuring will free up some of my time, especially once we hire a dedicated CFO to handle the financial operations my mother controlled. Your sustainable store designs could become a signature element of Sullivan Fresh Market, Grace suggested, a way to differentiate from competitors while reflecting authentic values. You sound like a CEO, Edward teased. Force of habit, Grace admitted with a smile. But I mean it. Your designs are impressive, Edward. They deserve to be more than hobby projects gathering dust in your garage. Later, as they sat together on Grace's porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the summer darkness, Edward turned to her with sudden seriousness. What happens now? With your experiment? Will you return to your real life as Grace Morgan? It was the question Grace had been asking herself since her identity was revealed. I don't know, she answered honestly. I've loved aspects of living here. The simplicity, the community, the anonymity, but I also have responsibilities to Morgan Enterprises that I can't ignore indefinitely. A compromise, perhaps? Edward suggested. You could maintain a presence here in Millfield, while gradually resuming some of your corporate duties. The best of both worlds. Grace leaned against his shoulder, contemplating this possibility. It could work. Technology makes remote leadership possible for many aspects of my role. And Millfield is only 2 hours from corporate headquarters. Just close enough for convenience, just far enough for separation, Edward observed. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the porch swing creaking gently beneath them, before Edward spoke again. There's one more thing we need to discuss. My mother. Grace straightened, sensing the shift in tone. You're worried about how she'll retaliate. She threatened you once with those fabricated photos. She won't stop there, especially now that she blames you for her humiliation at the company. Edward's expression was troubled. Diane Sullivan, with wounded pride, is a dangerous opponent, Grace. I'm not unfamiliar with corporate warfare, Grace reminded him. Morgan Enterprises has faced hostile takeover attempts, smear campaigns, industrial espionage. I can handle your mother. This is different, Edward insisted. This is personal for her. She'll aim to hurt you, to hurt us, not just professionally, but emotionally. You need to be prepared. Before Grace could respond, the harsh glare of headlights swept across the porch as a car pulled into her driveway. The sleek black sedan was unfamiliar, but the woman who emerged from it was immediately recognizable. Speaking of the devil, Edward muttered, rising to his feet. Diane Sullivan strode up the garden path with purposeful anger, her designer heels sinking slightly into the soft lawn. She wore the same outfit from the board meeting, though her perfect composure had frayed noticeably. Her hair slightly disheveled, her expression raw with fury. Mother, Edward said coolly as she reached the porch steps. This is unexpected. Is it? Diane's gaze slid past her son to focus on Grace with undisguised hostility. I thought I'd find you here, celebrating your victory with your accomplice. Mrs. Sullivan, Grace acknowledged calmly. Would you like to come inside? Perhaps we could discuss this civilly. Civilly? Diane laughed, the sound brittle with anger. Like you civilly infiltrated my son's life under false pretenses, or civilly orchestrated my removal from operational control of my own company? Edward stepped forward. Mother, that's enough. The board's decision was based on evidence of your own actions, nothing more. Evidence you never would have discovered without her, Diane retorted, jabbing a finger toward Grace. Don't be naive, Edward. Why do you think Grace Morgan, billionaire CEO, suddenly appeared in Millfield living like a commoner? She's after Sullivan Fresh Market, a hostile takeover by seduction. That's absurd, Edward began, but Grace touched his arm gently. It's all right, she said quietly. Let me address this. She turned to Diane, her voice calm but firm. Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you're hurt and angry. Finding a convenient villain is easier than accepting responsibility for your own choices. But the truth is, I came to Millfield for personal reasons that had nothing to do with your family or your business. You expect me to believe that? Diane scoffed. Whether you believe it or not doesn't change the facts, Grace replied evenly. I have no interest in acquiring Sullivan Fresh Market. My company operates in entirely different sectors. Then why the charade? Why hide your identity from my son? Grace considered her answer carefully. Because wealth distorts relationships. It creates power imbalances, ulterior motives, false personas. I wanted, just once, to connect with someone who saw me for who I am, not what I own. Something flickered in Diane's expression, a momentary crack in her armor of anger, a flash of unexpected recognition. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. How convenient, she said coldly. And how coincidental that you happened to meet my son, of all people. Millfield is a small town, Mother, Edward interjected. And I approached Grace first, remember? At the coffee shop. Diane's gaze shifted between them, calculation replacing some of her raw anger. "You've made a serious miscalculation, Miss Morgan. I built Sullivan Fresh Market from a struggling local business into a regional powerhouse. I know how to fight dirty when necessary, and I protect what's mine." "Mother, stop," Edward said sharply. "You're embarrassing yourself, and you're threatening the woman I love in front of me." The declaration hung in the summer air, significant and binding. Grace felt her heart swell with emotion as Edward moved to stand beside her, their hands finding each other automatically. Diane stared at their intertwined fingers, something like genuine pain crossing her features. "You don't know what you're saying, Edward. She's manipulating you." "No, Mother," Edward replied gently. "For the first time in years, I'm seeing clearly. About the business, about you, about what I want from my life. I love Grace. And if you can't accept that, can't at least try to understand, then you'll lose me far more completely than you lost control of the company today." His words landed with devastating accuracy. Diane took a physical step backward, as if the force of them had pushed her away. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of emotion. Edward resolute, Grace supportive beside him, Diane stunned by her son's ultimatum. Then, without another word, Diane turned and walked back to her car. The tires squealed slightly as she backed out of the driveway and disappeared down Maple Street. "Well," Grace said into the silence that followed, "that could have gone better." Edward let out a long breath, tension gradually leaving his shoulders. "Actually, it went better than I expected. She didn't threaten to disinherit me or have you investigated by the SEC. The night is still young," Grace observed wryly. Edward turned to face her fully, his expression suddenly vulnerable. "I meant what I said, you know, about loving you. I wasn't just saying it for my mother's benefit." Grace reached up to touch his face gently. "I know, and I love you too, Edward Sullivan, the architect with a passion for sustainability. The man who approached a stranger in a coffee shop because all the other tables were taken." "Was that really why?" Edward asked with a small smile. "Because the coffee shop was full?" "No," Grace admitted. "It wasn't. I'd noticed you before, watching you interact with the staff, seeing how you treated everyone with the same respect regardless of position. I wanted to know you before I even spoke to you." Edward leaned down to kiss her, a kiss that felt like a beginning rather than a continuation. When they finally separated, he rested his forehead against hers. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now," Grace replied, "we build something authentic together. No more secrets, no more pretending. Just us, figuring it out one day at a time. Even with my mother potentially plotting our downfall?" Edward's tone was light, but the concern behind his words was genuine. Grace smiled. "Even then? Though I suspect we haven't heard the last from Diane Sullivan." She was right. The confrontation on Grace's porch marked not an ending, but a turning point. The moment when the truth, finally laid bare between all parties, created the possibility for genuine change. The weeks that followed would bring challenges neither Grace nor Edward could anticipate, as Diane Sullivan grappled with her new reality and made choices that would ultimately determine whether reconciliation was possible. But standing there in the warm summer evening, their future stretching before them with all its complications and possibilities, Grace and Edward shared something precious. A connection founded initially on deception, but transformed through honesty into something true and enduring. A love strong enough to withstand the revelation of Grace's true identity. A partnership resilient enough to weather Diane's opposition. For Grace Morgan, who had spent years surrounded by wealth and power yet isolated by them, this authentic connection was worth more than all her billions. And for Edward Sullivan, who had spent his life torn between family obligation and personal aspiration, loving Grace offered a path to integration rather than compromise. Neither of them harbored illusions that the road ahead would be easy. But as they returned to the porch swing, hands intertwined and hearts aligned, they shared a quiet confidence in their ability to face whatever came next. Together, honestly, as their true selves. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Grace sat in her home office in Millfield, reviewing quarterly reports for Morgan Enterprises on her laptop, while occasionally glancing at the architectural renderings spread across the adjacent desk. Edward's sustainable design for the Sullivan Fresh Market flagship renovation had been unanimously approved by the board the previous week, marking the first visible sign of the company's new direction under reformed leadership. Their relationship had flourished, despite Diane's initial attempts at sabotage. A brief but vicious media campaign insinuating Grace was orchestrating a hostile takeover had fizzled when presented with facts and Edward's unwavering support. George Sullivan had emerged as an unexpected ally, quietly but firmly supporting his son's relationship while attempting to rebuild his damaged marriage. The doorbell rang, interrupting Grace's work. She opened the front door to find Diane Sullivan standing on her porch, looking somewhat diminished from their last encounter. Thinner, with less perfect makeup, her designer outfit replaced by something more subdued. "Mrs. Sullivan," Grace said, surprised. "Edward isn't here. He's overseeing the construction planning at the flagship store." "I know," Diane replied. "I came to see you, actually." Intrigued, Grace stepped aside. "Please, come in." Diane entered hesitantly, taking in the modest home with new eyes. They sat in the living room, an awkward silence stretching between them until Diane finally spoke. "I've been in therapy," she said abruptly. "George's idea, initially, but it's been illuminating." "I'm glad to hear that," Grace responded carefully. Diane met her gaze directly. "I owe you an apology, Miss Morgan. My behavior was inexcusable. The photos, the threats, the accusations." "Thank you," Grace said simply, recognizing the difficulty this admission must present for a woman like Diane. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Diane continued, "just to acknowledge the harm I caused, and to let you know that I'm trying to understand, to see things differently." She paused, her composure cracking slightly. "I love my son. I've always wanted to protect him." "I know," Grace said gently. "Edward knows that too. But I've been controlling him, not protecting him. I see that now." Diane's hands twisted in her lap. "When you appeared, living this simplified life, it triggered something in me. A fear I didn't even know I carried." Grace tilted her head questioningly. "What fear?" Diane's laugh was self-deprecating. "That without wealth, without status, without the trappings of success I've built my identity around, I wouldn't be enough. That I'd be the poor girl from the wrong side of town again, the one no one valued or respected." The admission was startlingly vulnerable, revealing depths to Diane Sullivan that Grace had never suspected existed. "Edward told me your family struggled financially when you were young," Grace said. "That his grandfather started the original store with the last of his savings." Diane nodded. "We were one bad month away from homelessness for years. I swore my children would never know that kind of insecurity. But somewhere along the way, financial security became about control, about power." She looked around the modest living room. "When I saw you living like this voluntarily, you, with all your billions, it felt like a judgment, a repudiation of everything I'd worked for." "It wasn't intended that way," Grace assured her. "My experiment was about finding authentic connection, not rejecting success or wealth." "I understand that now," Diane said. "Too late, perhaps, to undo the damage I've caused, but not too late, I hope, to begin rebuilding my relationship with my son." Grace considered the woman before her, still proud, still formidable, but now revealing glimpses of the vulnerability and fear that had driven her ruthless behavior. "Edward loves you," she said finally. "He's hurt and angry, but he wants his mother in his life, a mother who respects his choices, who sees him as an adult capable of making his own decisions, including his choice of you," Diane acknowledged. "Including that, yes." Diane stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. "I should go. Thank you for hearing me out." At the door, she paused. "My son loves you very much, Miss Morgan." despite my best efforts to convince him otherwise. A ghost of her old ironic humor surfaced briefly. Take care of him. He has a tender heart beneath all that Sullivan stubbornness. I will, Grace promised. And Mrs. Sullivan? It's not too late, for any of us. After Diane left, Grace stood at the window watching her departure, reflecting on the unexpected turn this morning had taken. Redemption was rarely straightforward or complete, but Diane's visit suggested possibilities that hadn't existed before, for healing, for understanding, perhaps eventually for genuine acceptance. When Edward arrived that evening, Grace shared the details of his mother's visit. His initial skepticism gradually gave way to cautious hope as he absorbed the significance of Diane's apology and vulnerability. "Do you think she's sincere?" he asked, as they prepared dinner together in the small kitchen. "I do," Grace replied, "though change won't happen overnight. Decades of behavior patterns don't disappear with a few therapy sessions." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Dad mentioned she's been different lately, more reflective, less controlling with him." "That's a good sign," Grace observed, setting plates on the table. As they sat down to their meal in the cozy dining nook, Edward reached across to take Grace's hand. "You know, 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be dating Grace Morgan, billionaire CEO, living part-time in a modest house in Millfield while redesigning my family's business, I would have thought they were crazy. Life is full of surprises," Grace agreed with a smile. "Some of them quite wonderful. The best surprise was finding you," Edward said, his eyes warm with affection. "The real you, who turned out to be a remarkable combination of Grace Williams and Grace Morgan." "Might," Grace squeezed his hand, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for this man who had seen beyond wealth and status to love the woman beneath all the labels and expectations. "I used to think wealth was the barrier to genuine connection," she reflected. "But really, it was my own fear of vulnerability, of being seen completely and judged wanting." "And now?" Edward asked. "Now I know that true connection requires courage. The courage to be fully, authentically yourself, regardless of how others might respond." Grace smiled. "A lesson worth every moment of my Millfield experiment, even the difficult ones." Outside the window, twilight settled over Maple Street. In the quiet neighborhood where Grace had sought anonymity and found love instead, porch lights began to illuminate one by one. A perfect metaphor, she thought, for the journey they had shared, from darkness into light, from deception into truth, from isolation into genuine connection. Whatever challenges awaited them, Diane's ongoing evolution, the pressures of balancing 2 lives between Millfield and the city, the inevitable complications of merging such different worlds, Grace felt equal to facing them, not because of her wealth or power, but because of the strength she had found in vulnerability, in honesty, in loving and being loved for exactly who she was. That, in the end, was the true fortune she had discovered in Millfield, one that no balance sheet could measure, no business success could rival, no amount of money could ever buy. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below. What city are you watching from? And if your heart tells you to, feel free to leave me a tip on Buy Me a Coffee. Just check the first pinned comment. Thanks for keeping me company and for the coffee, and I'll see you in the next story.